Hello and welcome to today's Partner Infopedia web conference. This is Fast Track D365 for Operations Tech Talk Integration. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Solution Architect Praveen Kumar. Praveen, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Janice. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Integrations Tech Talk. I see that we have a good number of participants who have not attended this before, so I'll keep that in mind as I go through the content. So today we have a good set of topics that we would be covering. Roughly, we would describe the integration framework that is available in AX, the components that are behind it. We'll also consider and go through some customer real-life scenarios and also show demos for those scenarios, and also the considerations based on which we selected the framework that we chose to achieve an integration scenario. And also towards the end, we'll also discuss about integrating between applications that are all on the cloud. All right, so with that, let's go down the memory lane a little bit. So in AX 2012, we had a service-based architecture. What that meant was we had a lot of integration frameworks that were available that many of you would be familiar with it. There was a custom services framework that we had. There used to be an AAF framework. There used to be a DXF framework. And many a times the artifacts that you would create for one framework would not translate and provide reusability in another framework. So if for different reasons you have to go and replicate similar logic, and which was not very desirable. And let's see how we address all these things in AX7. So similarly in 2012, if someone wants to enable a mobile scenario, there used to be a lot of setup that was involved. Even to get a simple authentication through, one has to set up a DMZ zone, which meant that you need to bring in someone who is very knowledgeable in network security, set up an ADFS, and there was a lot of moving parts to the solution to achieve something simple. It could be achieved, but there were a lot of moving parts and a little bit more effort to achieve it. We'll also see how this entire flow has been simplified in Dynamics 365 operations. So in the new integration framework, most of our integration is built out of the data entity. Compared to 2012, in D365 operations, the data entity is a first-class citizen. It was built right from the get-go, and it is deeply embedded at a kernel level. Data entity, as many of you would have already known, is a framework that provides you a simple denormalized view of a complex data structure, and in order to represent a business concept. Say, for example, if I want to represent a customer, the actual customer data might be stored across multiple tables behind. But if I want to build a simple integration scenario and the end user wants to interact with it, it gives a lot of benefit for the end user if the data was simplified in a flat file, in a flat format structure. Right? And there are talks about data entities that you can attend and understand how to create one. For this purpose, we'll briefly stop at that particular point. Right? So based upon this data entity, once you have a data entity created, now that data entity is automatically exposed as an OData service, provided that you opt to do so. Once you can expose it as no data service. Once you do that, now all of a sudden Office integrations, mobile and third-party applications can talk to this OData REST-based endpoint and get data and create data and do all the CRUD operations that are needed. Similarly, the same data entity is also exposed through the data management platform to enable scenarios around file-based integrations that are larger volume. The same platform is also used for application lifecycle management scenarios like data migration, copying configurational data across different companies, so on and so forth. As you can see in AX7, once you have a data entity created, there is a lot of reusability that you are able to get from it. There are though some scenarios where a customer would choose to do something very custom. For those cases, there is a possibility for you to expose classes and contracts as a custom service. Once again, this flow is simplified now. The moment you have a custom service and you have enabled it, we automatically expose that as two different endpoints. The same classes and services are exposed as a SOAP endpoint as well as in REST-based API. The SOAP, as you all know, would be an XML messaging format, and the REST-based API also allows the JSON format. JSON is preferred in the web world now. The data compression and everything is better using JSON. Right? So this gives you an overview of the integration frameworks available in D365 for operations. As I said, the data entity is the mainstay in this integration framework, and there are a lot of uses that you can drive out of this. Even many other newer upcoming frameworks are built on top of the data entity to build additional integration patterns and flows. So let's just quickly understand and look at how the data management platform works. So let's say if you have a set of source files which have structured data in them, which aligns to what the data entity's format looks like, you'll be able to bring that data using the DMF platform. Behind the scenes, what we do is the moment we get the data, we use Azure Blob Storage to save it. This is the blob storage that is hosted within the Microsoft's own subscription. From the Azure Blob Storage, we have a service called DXF service that picks up these files and uses SSIS packages to bring the data into a staging table within the database of AX. Since we use SSIS, all know that SSIS has the ability to do multi-threading. It can have multiple flows. Parallelism is involved. So this particular flow is really optimized to bring in a huge amount of data into the system. Once you have the data in your staging environment, then you can apply the logic, business rules, validations, and the denormalization that the data entity provides to move that same data into a target table. This exact same flow in the reverse order is how the data management platform would export data for these data entities as well. So concentrating on integration scenarios, roughly we'll split the integration requirements into two. Right? There is a real-time integration requirements, and there are requirements where I don't need it to be synchronous. It's a message-based asynchronous patterns is another integration scenario that we would consider. So when we want to use real-time integration scenarios, you could use OData endpoints. They are REST APIs, and thereby they give you a synchronous input-output. Similarly, you can write your own custom services if there is a need, and bring in data. On the other hand, if you have a message-based integration scenario, which is sometimes it could also involve larger data files, or if you want to implement some sort of save and forward type pattern for queuing and stuff like that, then there is a lot of support for that in the data management platform's APIs in order for you to do that. So now let's just look at how the landscape has changed between AX 2012 and D365 operations. So in 2012, we used to have document services, which in AX in D365 is replaced by data entities. Right? Document services at that time modeled a document. Now the documents can be modeled by a data entity. Similarly, the SOAP-based metadata service and query service all have been replaced by REST-based and OData endpoints. The custom services that were present before, which were SOAP-based, is also present in D365 operations. So if you had artifacts that were developed in 2012, during an upgrade process, they would basically transfer into the newer environments, and they'll be able to work automatically. The JSON based is an additional endpoint that you get automatically out of box for even for the custom services that you bring in from 2012. The OData service and the REST metadata service are all new in operations, basically. So initially we spoke about the complexities that were involved in achieving a simple mobile authentication in 2012. In AX7, since Azure Active Directory is our authenticator, the flow that we use to authenticate here is OAuth based. So in Azure Active Directory, you'll be able to go create clients for your integration clients. And there are ability for you to set them up as either native clients, which is driven off of a user context. So it would require a username and a password to authenticate. Or you can set up a service-to-service integration scenario, like a web app type client, that will enable you to provide a client ID and a client secret without providing a username and password to get yourself authenticated. And there are different requirements that are available. It's a very well documented in Azure blogs, where you can go and find out in what scenarios would native clients would come into picture, in what scenarios do web app clients would come into the picture. But irrespective of whichever direction that you choose, once you set up a client in Azure Active Directory, the integration external application will be able to authenticate against Azure Active Directory and get the bearer tokens that is required to authenticate against Dynamics AX. Once again, any logic that runs within AX is run in a context of an end user. And that is required because the end user's roles and information is needed to apply access control rules. And this is basically the flow. The client application initially makes a call to Azure Active Directory, gets back a token. That token is tagged along to every request that the external client application does to AX, and get responses back. So now let's go through some customer scenarios that we have seen in the past and see how each of those customers decided to achieve their integration scenario in the new world. So this explains a simple PLM integration scenario where the PLM system was a legacy system which was present and not very extendable, and you won't be able to customize it much. The only type of information that the PLM system was able to provide out was through a file-based import and export. And the PLM system provided that data in an XML format. The PLM system was a master for the products for this particular customer, and they maintained their BOM and other information in the PLM system. They wanted to build an integration flow which allowed them to handle errors synchronously, and that was a requirement that they had. So based on this requirement, you would have guessed that they would have wanted to use an OData endpoint, and products and BOM and materials, these are all structured data that could be put in a tabular format. So the solution that they came up with was using OData interface to ultimately talk to AX that provided them the synchronous callout. It also let them do the synchronous error handling. But the PLM system, on the other hand, provided data as a file import export. So to bridge these two scenarios, they wrote a simple .NET application that basically gets a file from the PLM system, goes through it line by line, and makes OData calls into AX. Similarly, it gets data from AX through OData and exports it as a file for the PLM system to read. So this was one simple application. In another customer scenario that we looked at, the customer wanted to have some sort of an e-commerce site for their end customers. And whenever a shopping cart was confirmed and finalized and purchased, they immediately wanted a synchronous synchronously create that sales order within AX. So once again, as you can determine that since you need a synchronous way of doing this, they chose to use the OData endpoint to talk to AX7. And some of the other requirements that they had was they wanted to use PHP because they had familiarity in that technology, and and they had this e-commerce site that was pre-built, and they have been using it for a while. The amount of data, the sales order data was pretty low volume, and they preferred to use an OData endpoint. So let me quickly show you a demo on how to use an OData, how to code against an OData endpoint in Dynamics AX. So I have a system that I deployed, which is basically the system which is running in this box. So I have a simple Visual Studio sample application. This is the same sample application that is available in GitHub that I downloaded and made some minor modifications to. So one of the things that you would encounter when you write code against an REST-based endpoint is you might have to write HTTP post and GET calls. While it is possible for you to write it, and you can certainly invest time in doing that, there is a better way of writing against an OData endpoint. So the advantage over here is if you are using a simple HTTP GET post objects to make these calls, then you will be dealing with a loosely typed data. So you're going to get a JSON object. You don't know the structure ahead of time. You have to parse in, do the serialization, deserialization, and handle that scenario. On the other hand, there is a way by which you could get the metadata of the OData endpoint. I'll show you how the OData endpoint metadata looks like. So if you were to pop open your AX URL and put data at the end of it and type metadata. I misspelled it, my bad. Let's try again. Just gonna take a couple of seconds to load this completely. It's still loading here. So as you can see, the data that it's gonna collect is gonna be in XML format. It's still loading, and it's gonna collect the entire metadata of all your data entities, and it's gonna have information about what each data entity schema looks like, what are the fields it has, what is the type of that field, and so on and so forth. I'll let this run for a while, or in fact, switch over and use Internet Explorer. Oops. Right, let me minimize that. Pop that information. So this is the metadata of that endpoint. So if I were to search for information, so you can actually see that there is an entity here called released product masters. It has what is the key of that. You have different properties about that of all the different fields that are present in that entity, the type of fields they are, whether they are using enums or not, and associated labels. Right? So it would be better to reflect over this metadata and create simple POCO classes and code against those POCO classes in order to code against something that is strongly typed, and that would tremendously increase the speed of developing a solution. So in order to do that, there is actually an extension that is available that you can all download. If you were to go online and search for OData client, you'll actually see an extension called OData for version 4 OData client code generator. If you download and install it, I have already downloaded and installed that. It actually, and then if you have to add it to your C# project, you'll actually see that it creates a TT file. So if I were to open this file, you can actually see that I popped in that metadata URL that this particular tool is gonna read. When I run this tool, it's gonna read the data from that particular file, and it's gonna create a .cs file. Basically, it's gonna create classes for each of the data behind the scenes, data entity behind the scenes for me, and now you will be able to code against that strongly typed classes. So I have already right-clicked that and said run custom tool, and it already created that classes for me. So I'll show you how I'm going to use that to achieve some simple scenarios. So let me go back to my program.cs. So we are going to go through some simple scenarios first. So I'm going to comment out other scenarios. So you can actually see that this is the file that got generated. I'm creating a variable to capture that. Let me zoom this a little bit in so everyone can see. This resources is what that OData client generated. So I'm creating a context. So think of that as your AX client. Now I can basically on that context say, before I send any request, I call in an authentication helper and authenticate against myself. The code for this helper is available on GitHub. We can share you the links at the end of the call. So once it gets authenticated, I'm passing that context into this method called read legal entities. And now in read legal entities, you can actually see the way I read the legal entities from AX. All you need to do is do context.legal entities and make it enumerable. Now you will be able to get all the legal entities within AX. So if I were to run this, and I'm basically printing it onto the console screen here. So if I run this solution, you can actually see that how I'm actually able to read the legal entities in AX. So now this is about reading data from AX. You will have scenarios where you would want to write data into AX. I'll quickly show you how to do that. So let's just take a simple example of creating a sales order in AX. So to create a sales order, I actually created an object called sales order header. Once again, this is a class that was created by that OData client. Now all of a sudden this became strongly typed. So, and then I create a collection. And the reason why I create a collection is to keep track of any changes I make to this variable. I'll tell you why that is important later. And as you would normally do, you set up the different sales order numbers, the different parameters that you would set in here. Similarly, you create the line related to the sales order in here. And then I'm going to call context.savechanges. And this is the context on which all these things were created. You can see that the collection is actually driven off of this context. So when I call context.savechanges, you will actually see these changes made in AX. So let me try running this. And in the meantime, let me head over to AX. Accounts receivable, all sales orders. So you can see 98001 was created over here. If I go into it, you will see that the line was also created. And if I look at my application, it says 98001 was saved successfully. So one of the things to note in this example is, so I talked about the need to keep track of the changes that happen to this particular variable, right? And the reason why that is important is when I make this context save changes, you only want to post only the fields that were set over here, right? If that changes are not being tracked and I make a save, the fields that were not set by this by your code will be treated as nulls, and it will reach the AX endpoint saying that set those fields as nulls. You do not want that to happen, and AX will throw an error when that happens, right? And there's a flag that you will also enable for this special scenario saying that post only set properties. When I turn this thing on, and if it's tracked by a collection, it'll only post use in the HTTP post only send those objects that were modified by your code. Similarly, you'll actually see here there's another flag that I'm setting here that says batch with single chain set. If I do not provide this particular flag, and if I call save changes, it is going to make one call for the header and one call for the line, and they both are going to be run in two different database contexts, which is something that you don't want, both from a network point of view and also from a data consistency point of view. You will have scenarios where you want the header to be rolled back if one of its associated line fails to save in AX. Right? All these things could be achieved by enabling this particular flag that says post with batch, as well as make it into a single chain set. So when you do that, that entire changes that you made will run in a single database transaction, and if one of these objects fail, the entire transaction will get rolled back. I can quickly show you how that works. I'm going to create a new one, and let's say for shipping site, I'm gonna say ABC. Obviously that is a mistake. There is no site called ABC, and I'm gonna run this application now. Let's go into AX and refresh and see this. You can actually see that the 98002 request actually failed, and you can actually see here that the header is not created. I'll also show you what will happen if I don't enable that. And run this application now. So here it actually failed on the lines. I actually handled the exception and provided a message there. And if I were to come here, you'll actually see that 98002 was created without the lines, right? Sometimes you might have customer scenarios where you do not specifically want this to happen. So this basically shows a demo on about the OData. Let me quickly switch back. Like that. So now let's look at another scenario where the customer wants to provide packing slip integration, and think of there's a big conveyor belt that is going on, and there is a device that is looking at the box that's going to get packed, and there is roughly 30 seconds from that particular point in time where the box starts in the conveyor belt to the printing station where you want that particular packing slip to be printed. So now you have two options to go achieve it. One is using custom services and batch. Custom services is actually a better solution over here, because batch would mean that you would have to do it at specific recurrence, and the recurrence that you would have is 1 minute. That's the lowest granularity you can have in AX. So in this scenario, you would use a custom service to achieve this scenario. And once again, for this demo, let me quickly show you how a SOAP endpoint works. So here I created a SOAP application where I have created a service behind in AX, the same way you do it in 2012. And let's see what happens when I run this application. So you can actually see that we are making the call to AX using SOAP-based protocol. and we are able to get back results, and we are able to handle it, right? So if there is all this demo is present in the GitHub, as I said, and you can take a look at these later. So let's say on the other hand, let's say you have an unstructured data that you want to bring into the system. And in this example, it is a bank payment file that that AX used to generate at the end of processing, and you want to save that securely in a secure file in an automated fashion. And since it is a HBI data, a high business impact data, you do not want any end user to be in the loop and touch this, right? So to enable this scenario, there is multiple ways of doing it. Obviously, it was easier to do that in 2012 because 2012 was an on-premises solution. Now that AX is on the cloud, you have one solution where you can directly couple AX7 to an SFTP server, and AX can directly write the file into that SFTP server. Some of the problems with this approach is now AX7 and the SFTP server are coupled with each other. Instead of the SFTP server, imagine it to be a different application. And what if tomorrow that application is replaced by some other application? Now that creates a ripple effect because of this tighter coupling. Right? So another thing that you can think about is taking that same payment file and putting it to a blob storage, and having another daemon process or another client that actually reads from the blob storage and writes it to a secure file share. Once again, the question then becomes, which blob storage do you want to use? You could obviously do this thing using a blob storage that the customer or the partner brings in, or you can use the blob storage that is already available within Microsoft's subscription. And obviously, since this blob storage is within Microsoft subscription, no one else outside that subscription can have access to this blob storage. So in this scenario, let's see quickly how I'm able to expose that files that are being saved in that blob storage to be downloaded and acted upon from an external application. There is a library called Shared Service Utils Library, Storage Library, that is available in AX7 that you can use in Express to code against the Azure Blob Storage that is present within the AX network. So, to showcase this demo, I'll quickly go into a simple form that I created. And let me just create a simple file here. Let's say I'm going to do hello world dot text file, and within it I'm going to say hello world, and I'm going to upload this to that blob storage. Obviously, the code behind here uses the shared storage utilities to write it to the blob storage that is present within AX. So if I want to read this thing, now there is no out-of-box endpoint that is available for an external application to read it from this particular place. So we created a simple custom service that looks at this endpoint and lets it stream this file out to an external client. Right? So we have created that in AX, and we have deployed it. It's a very simple client, and let's see how an external client can download it. So if I were to come to additional demos and go to programs, and if I were to run this, start a project, and if I say let me go to demo, you can see there is no file for that present right now. I start the run. You can actually see that file got downloaded from here through that custom service. And if I were to go back in AX and check, that file is gone now because it has been downloaded and acknowledged as such. Right? So this is one way by which you could expose the blob storage within AX. So now let's quickly look at some of the technologies that are upcoming and are also present that helps you achieve cloud-based integrations, right? So we thought at one point that cloud is gonna be the only place where everyone would and deploy solutions in sometime in future, right? But that is not today. More and more we are seeing applications moving towards a hybridized solution where there are still applications running on premises and still applications on the cloud. So to consider integrations in this scenario, the thing that Microsoft has worked on is it has created BizTalk solutions for the cloud and logic apps for the cloud that make use of these connectors that are built for third-party applications. Similarly, there are Azure services that these orchestrators can take advantage of. Similarly, you can write your custom own API and deploy it in an API management and publish it and monitor the usage. And as well as a lot of EDI transformations, B2B solutions are also available. A simplified version of Logic Apps is what Microsoft Flow is, and Microsoft Flow would basically let you orchestrate some of these simpler integration solutions. Obviously, if you want an enterprise-grade, a much more custom-driven integration orchestration, then you would use Logic Apps. If you want even more advanced, granular integration scenarios, then you would continue to use BizTalk or other integration providers. So in a hybrid integration solution where you already have a BizTalk running on premises and AX7 having some data, you can use Logic Apps to actually bridge and create a network integration flow between your cloud asset and your on-premises integration solution. One notable point over here that I want to bring up is many people would basically shut off incoming requests into their firewall for security reasons. So using AID application proxy, you will be able to install a connector on premises and only open up outgoing ports and securely thereby expose your internal endpoints to the public world in a very secure and authenticated manner. There are a lot of options for that authentication, and by doing this you'll be able to enable a hybrid integration from your cloud assets to on-premises assets in a secure fashion. Obviously that is not the only solution. You can use Azure Service Bus. There are a lot of other solutions, but this is one popular solution that is being considered. So in the roadmap, the OData connector for Logic Apps is already available and it is presently in the preview mode. The file connector that would allow people to provide a file and bring it into AX and run using recurring integration is on the roadmap, and it is presently not available. There are other hybrid connectors that are also in the works. Now let me quickly show you a simple scenario, a similar file-based integration scenario that we were able to orchestrate using Logic Apps. So everyone would be familiar with what a recurring integration project is within AX. It is basically a DMF project that you would set recurrent settings on, and that basically says either import this particular file every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, once a day, or in a given recurrence, and it will be monitoring a particular queue from which it's going to pick up the file and process these information in the file using the data entities. Similarly, you can create one for an outbound scenario as well, where on a recurring fashion you can enable exporting data, like say exporting customers on a recurring basis. You can also turn on change tracking, and you can only export data in an incremental fashion as well. So I have set a recurring job within the system. So let me show that to you quickly. So if I go to data management workspace, if I go to the recurring jobs, you'll actually see that I have set up a job here called AMT underscore asset major type, and that is an inbound recurring job that is going to constantly be polling for downloading files from the queue. So once I have set up something of this sort, now we were able to create a Logic app which would monitor a local folder on premises and pick that particular file up. So for simplicity's sake, instead of on-premises folder, we have used an OneDrive solution. And we get some information about that file so that we understand based on that file name which integration endpoint it needs to go to, which company it needs to go to, and which recurring job it needs to be queued against. Once we get that information, you can actually see that we get an activity ID, which is the recurring integration ID if you're familiar with recurring integrations. And when we are able to determine an activity ID, we actually branch out and do things on the left. On the off chance that we are not able to get an activity ID, then we basically move that file into a different folder on my OneDrive folder and immediately send out a notification to someone who is monitoring this, letting them know that there is an integration failure so that they can investigate about it. So in the scenario where I'm able to get an activity ID, then I call the enqueue API. This is basically a file connector that we put together using a simple HTTP gateway. As I said, all these endpoints are HTTP endpoints REST-based. So we basically call that to enqueue it. Once we enqueue it, if the enqueue was not successful, once again we move to its appropriate folder and send an email alert. If it is successful, then we move it to a processing folder and we constantly we keep checking the status of that file, whether it got successfully exported, because it's an asynchronous pattern, file based. So if it was not successfully processed, then we move it to an error folder and send a notification. If it's successfully processed, we move it to a processed folder and then we delete that particular file from the processing folder. Right? So this is a simple integration that we were able to write completely in Logic Apps with everything that is available right now. So let me show you how this works. So I take so this is the folder that the system is monitoring right now, and let me go to integration, go to the demo files, and let's say I put in a file which the system is not going to recognize, let's say. Right? So if I go back to the Logic Apps, I can monitor what is happening in the system. So I can keep and find out if there is a new run. Looks like there is a new run. And if we go into the run, it actually shows that it picked up that file. It tried to ascertain information about that particular file. It was not able to find it. So it actually moved it to a error folder. And you can actually see that it sent me an email. So if I were to go here to my inbox, now I am able to see that particular file and with a message that says it's not able to process that. Now I can go investigate about it. Similarly, if I go into the error folder, you'll actually find the same file over here as well. Right? So on the other hand, let me showcase a successful file scenario. Now I'm putting this particular file here. I'm going to go back to my Logic Apps. You can see that it actually triggered here. The Logic app is running. It was able to enqueue it. Now presently it is waiting because I just enqueued it. I wanted to take a couple of seconds to process. We can see that same detail within the data management view as well. So if I were to come here, okay, so if I were to come here, you can actually see that file that I threw was queued. If I keep checking, it is now moving to in process. I can go to Logic app and see that after the delay, it found out that it was not ready. Now if I go back and check for the status, now it is processed. Since it was successfully processed, it actually moved that file to processed folder and it deleted it from the processing folder. So you can see that how we can build a simple Logic app based on this. So this pretty much covers everything that I wanted to cover. Now we can move to the Q&A section. Janice?
All right, thank you, Praveen. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be starting our Q&A session in just one moment. But before we do that, I'd like to share out that URL that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to go ahead and pop that into your messages panel. You should be seeing it on the left-hand side of your screen right now. That's a link to a short survey for this web conference, and we ask that you please take a moment before logging out to access it. We hope that you found today's information helpful, and if you enjoyed today's web conference or have feedback on how we can provide you with a better event, this is your chance to let us know. The survey scores are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Praveen and Mark to answer any questions that are outstanding. Praveen?
Yep. So are there any questions on the phone? If there are, I can first take those.
We just have the ones that are in the queue.
Okay, then I can just start from here. Okay, how do I resolve an error? Incremental push is not supported. So this seems to be a support type question. We can, for the interest of time, we can take this offline and resolve this. Yes, if you're trying to modify and read-only field, the data entity would try to provide an error message saying that that field is read-only and not meant to be changed. So the demo that I showed used two different entities. Sales order was a separate entity and a sales line was a separate entity. They need not be associated entities like these two. They could be completely different. The intention for using the single change set is you want whatever changes that you are trying to make to be done in an atomic fashion. So this relieves a huge pain point of you not using a composite entity. Yes, using OData, I need to check. I haven't tried it. I think they could pass in as long as if it's not part of a data entity. If you write a custom service and you're going to get a REST API, you can pass image files and PDFs to that. If you want to use data entity, though, you can call into the DMF API. That would accept a package, and within a package there is an ability to pass in image files, PDF files, any unstructured files that you want to push it to the document management. Yes, these examples are present in GitHub. If you were to go to GitHub and search for Dynamics AX integrations, you'll be able to see examples for all these. Yes, so we are presently in the process of looking at and templatizing the logic app solution that we have created. This is something that anyone can put together, but we thought we would ship out or like share with the larger team a template that would help you guys to get this process started, and obviously you can take the template, deploy it into your subscription and make modifications. We have a flow for both enqueuing files as well as for dequeuing files, and we are as always looking for feedback, and we'll be most likely publishing those in the GitHub as well. Yes, there are connectors available in Logic Apps for monitoring SFTP sites, FTP sites, even local files that are on a VM that's hosted behind a VPN. The way that would work is by installing a connector, a secure connector behind your firewall, so that you don't have to expose your folder structure publicly to everyone out there, right? So that is possible. So since we are using a HTTP connector, we use the same OData authentication mechanism. Say, for example, if I come into this HTTP call, now I need to go to the designer view. So let me close this and go to edit. And this is provided out of the box. So when you create this HTTP connector, there is this thing that says advanced options. And if you were to go in there, it's going to ask you for authentication authority tenant. I'm not going to scroll here because it's getting recorded. It has a client ID and a client secret column over there as well. You can provide these information and it will basically authenticate against the REST API. So it is not a separate flow compared to all the other integration flows in AX. Okay, what else? I think, oh, 13 pending questions. So we used everything that was available publicly to put together the template, but we will be sharing this. So we have covered that. I'm not sure if there is a connector for Access TV. You can check if there is one. If there is one, then life becomes easier and you can use that connector. On the other hand, if you have something completely custom that you want to plug into Logic Apps, you can actually use what are called an API app. Create an API app, which is basically like a C# library that which takes parameters into a method and does whatever logic that you write, and you can deploy that within Azure, and Logic Apps can call into that and trigger. So you can envision a scenario where the Logic App trigger flows, and one of the connectors could be your API app that was completely custom written to do whatever you want to do. And the flow would now switch over to your API app and it will run the logic that you have specified. So if you don't have connectors available, you don't need to wait for connectors to come out. Obviously, if there is one, that's going to make everyone's life easier, but it is not going to be limiting. You can put together an API app yourself and connect to Logic Apps. So I'm not familiar with Scribe's functionalities in full, but Logic Apps provides similar functionalities to what Scribe provides. And I have seen people connect, use Logic Apps to uh, create flows between different CRM system and AX, and you can basically do those as well. There are connectors available for some of the popular CRM applications out there, AX, OneDrive, and so on and so forth. I might have to look into this scenario a little bit more in order for me to assist you here. So let's take this offline. So there's tons of materials available on Logic Apps. One of the popular places for you to look at is called Microsoft Ignite. Ignite is a conference where a lot of upcoming topics are being showcased, and there is a lot of video and content around creating Logic Apps in general, and about different connectors, how would you templatize it, what ARM templates would look like, and so on and so forth. Yes, we'll package all these things up and put it in the GitHub solution. If you're not aware of the GitHub solution that's already present, let me traverse over there. There we go. So this is the URL, and you can actually see all the examples that I showcased being shown over here. And we are constantly adding newer examples to this. Jason, we might have to take this thing offline because I need to debug this in order for me to understand what's going on there. Masha, could you clarify which automated job are you talking about? I'll look for that answer later. So OData supports deletion as an interface, but if the data entity is created in a fashion to allow that operation, you can do it. If the data entity explicitly does not allow you to delete it, then that operation would result in a no-op scenario. So the logic apps could be versioned, yes, and they could be checked into VSTS. So the logic apps that I'm using, and we are having a VSTS and we're checking it in. If I go into logic apps, if I go into the logic apps, there is a code view over here, and this code view is what you would use to check it in. That code view can be copied and templatized and provided and deployed in different places. Any other questions? Any other questions on the phone?
Nope, none on the phone.
Okay. Let's go down. So this was not a custom job at all. The recurring jobs is an out-of-box functionality that allows a data entity or a collection of data entity along with sequence information to be run in a recurring fashion, very similar to the batch framework, except that here the recurring endpoint also exposes a public endpoint that you can connect towards. So this is all out of the box for that recurring job. So presently there are connectors available for OData interface that is presently in preview mode. There is one that is in the works for file connector, and that will be released in some time. But it is not going to limit you from using logic apps because, as I said, all the endpoints that are present are HTTP endpoints. So as long as you can use a HTTP connector, you'll be able to make calls into AX, authenticate, and integrate with those endpoints. So looks like we are at the top of at the end of the hour. Janice, if you want to take over at this point.
All right, thank you, Praveen. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to conclude today's Infopedia web conference. Attendees can access a web conference recording via a link that will be delivered within 3 to 5 days, business days post-conference. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters, Praveen, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today. This does conclude today's web conference, and you may now disconnect.